There's a conversation that almost every family knows they should have, and yet somehow it keeps getting pushed into the future. Maybe it's because everyone is busy, or perhaps nobody wants to spend a Saturday afternoon talking about wills, taxes, or what happens when you're no longer around. Or maybe it's because these conversations force us to think about questions that don't have easy answers. Whatever the reason is, the conversation often gets postponed. And what's interesting is that the longer I've worked in this profession, the more convinced I've become that the greatest risk in estate planning is usually not the tax bill, or the legal documents, or even the investment strategy. It's the fact that the conversation never happened in the first place. Hi everyone, Demir here from Westmount Wealth Management. Today I want to talk to you about legacy planning, but probably not in the way most expect. When people hear the words estate planning, they often think about documents, wills, trusts, powers of attorney, insurance policies. And yes, those things definitely matter, but those are really just tools. The more important question is what those tools are trying to accomplish. What is the goal? What is our objective? I often see families spend months discussing how assets should be transferred while spending very little time discussing why they're being transferred, what values they're intended to support, and what the role that wealth is meant to play in the lives of the next generation. In other words, we become very focused on the mechanics, and sometimes we forget the purpose. And that's where things can start to unravel rather quickly. One of the most fascinating studies on wealth transfer looked at more than 3,000 families and found that roughly 70% of wealth transfers fail by the second generation, and close to 90% by the third. Now, when most people hear that statistic, they assume the problem is taxes, poor investments, or bad legal advice and planning. Well, it simply wasn't. The majority of failures were linked to communication breakdowns within the family and the heirs who simply weren't prepared for the responsibility that came along with that wealth. Think about that for a moment. The documents were often there, and the money was often there. The conversations weren't. And honestly, that's not particularly surprising. Talking about money with family can be very uncomfortable. Talking about fairness can be even harder, because fairness isn't always as simple as dividing everything equally. What happens when one child works in the family business and another doesn't? What happens in blended families? What happens when one child is financially independent and another one is struggling? Those aren't legal questions, they're family questions, and they require discussion long before signatures start appearing on any legal documents. I sometimes compare estate planning to building a bridge. The legal documents, trusts, and tax structures are the engineering. They're incredibly important because they determine whether the bridge will stand for a very long time across multiple generations. But the conversation is the blueprint. Without a blueprint, you can have an excellent, engineering plan and still end up building something that doesn't take people where they need to go. That's why some of the most effective estate planning conversations have very little to do with tax first. They start with questions like, what is this wealth actually for? What opportunities do we want to create? What responsibilities should come with those opportunities? What values are we hoping to survive long after we've gone? Once those questions are answered, the structures become much easier to design. And that's where the technical planning absolutely matters. Canada doesn't have an inheritance tax, but that doesn't mean that death is tax-free. Capital gains can be triggered, registered accounts can become taxable, and probate can create additional costs depending on the province of your residence or jurisdiction. For business owners, trusts, estate freezes, holding companies, and lifetime capital gain exemptions can all play important roles. But I've found that the technical solutions tend to work best when they're supporting a clearly defined purpose, rather than just trying to shoehorn one in or create one out of thin air. At Westmount Wealth Management, this is why we view estate planning as part of the broader family conversation, rather than a collection of, legal documents. The goal isn't simply to transfer assets efficiently. While that's important, it's to transfer them intentionally, because a will can distribute wealth, but what it can't distribute is wisdom, trust, communication, and purpose. Those things have to be shared while we're still here to share them. And ultimately, that's why legacy planning is not really about death at all. It's about stewardship. It's about deciding, while you still can, what your wealth is meant to do, and helping the next generation understand not only what they're receiving, but why they're receiving it. Because legacy isn't simply what gets left behind. It's what gets passed forward with intention. Lastly, remember that giving doesn't have to wait until you're 6 feet under the ground. So do your giving while you're living, so you're knowing where it's going. Thanks for watching, and as always, if you have any questions, you know where to find us.